Good morning, everybody, or afternoon, whatever time it is in your world. Welcome to the Classico handbag videos. We're going to start with the flap on this section. So I have my lining panel, my exterior panel, some foam stabilizer. Both of these panels have been interfaced with a woven fusible interfacing. I also have my pattern piece because I'm going to need that for my marking for my magnetic fastener, and I have a bunch of magnetic fasteners. So let's just get those bits out. I need a male and a female part and the two washers. I'm going to pop that out of the way. Okay, so we'll start with adding our magnetic fastener to the lining panel. I'm just going to put the other bits out of the way there for a second, and I'm going to use my template to mark where this magnetic fastener needs to go. Now, your template is only half of the panel, but as long as you lay it right up against the sides, you can use the black mark on the pattern piece to indicate the center, or if you feel more confident, you can fold your panel in half and you'll find that's exactly right. Actually, that dot is still on that halfway line, but if you really feel that you're not confident with the pattern piece marking the center, then that's the easiest way to do it. So we're going to take one of our washers from the back of our magnetic fastener, position it over the top of that mark that we just made, and I'm just going to mark the two upright holes, and then I'm going to use a craft knife because I much prefer to use a craft knife on this. I'm more in control of a craft knife than I am of a seam ripper, so use whatever suits you best. And I'm just making two little holes where those marks went, and I'm going to take the male part, which is the usually the thinner parts. Most of these things have one sort of fat side and one thin side. Some of them are thin both sides, but I'm going to take the male part, which is the one that's got the small protrusion on it, and pop the lugs on the back straight through those two little holes you've just created. Now, I usually like to add a little bit of spare faux leather or something like that to the back. So I have a little piece here, which I'm just going to cut the two holes in so that I've got the appropriate holes. And this just helps to stabilise the back of your fastener. See, I mean, I haven't cut it to shape. It's just, you could use a bit of Peltex, you could use a bit of Decaville. I just use scraps of faux leather. Then we're going to add the washer. I'm going to make sure that that's sitting nicely, and then I'm going to push the prongs on the back of our magnetic fastener outwards. And the reason I do them outwards, I don't think there is a right or wrong, an outwards or an inwards, and you can be an outie or an innie, is that if you push them in towards the centre, they overlap in the middle and they create quite a large lump on the back of your work, which will rub eventually. So I prefer to push them out. They're just as secure one way or the other. It makes no difference. And so there we have it on the front, looking fine and dandy. I'm going to put that out of the way for a second, and I'm going to grab, make sure you put the other half of your fastener somewhere safe. I'm going to grab the exterior panel and my foam, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew baste all the way around the outside of this panel to baste the foam in place. And the one thing I will say is that any of you that have watched a video with me before will know that I sew on a Juki. My Juki is currently in the machine shop being fixed, so I'm actually sewing on a Husqvarna Mega Quilter. It's not a machine that I'm particularly familiar with, so if I appear to be incompetent, it's probably because I am. I've been trying to learn how everything works, and it's similar to my machine, but it's not the same. So you'll forgive me if I look like I'm a bit kind of befuddled by it all. It's just different. So I'm going to sew baste all the way around the outside using the longest sticks that I have on the machine, and in this case it's a 6. If you're not sure about sew basting, it's always a good idea to use a different coloured thread, so a brightly coloured thread, so you know when it comes to it which lines of stitching you need to remove. I'm just going to use the ones that are in my machine, simply because I'm generally quite good at removing the right stitches. So you don't need to back stitch at the beginning and the end. And the other thing I will say is this machine is a little noisier than my Juki, so if it sounds a bit like a train's coming through your sewing room it's because it's actually hitting mine, not yours. All the way around, and I'm doing this basting stitching at about 1/8 of an inch seam allowance, so it's going to be within the seam allowance. We will be removing all of the basting stitches afterwards, so don't worry too much if you're not sticking to a perfect 1/8 of an inch, but don't go bigger than we need to. All of the seam allowances for this pattern are within the pattern itself, so I'm not necessarily going to tell you what the seam allowances are on each part of the video. So you need to learn, you need to read the pattern as well, so you know it's a double-edged thing. I'm pretty sure that a lot of people could make this with just using the videos if they had the pattern pieces, but sometimes it's good to learn to read patterns too. As you can see, my foam is actually larger than my panel, and I generally do this if I can. I just find it's a lot easier than it is to try and match up a piece of foam to the size of your exterior panel. No matter how well you cut it, it often just doesn't match, and it's annoying. So, having basted all around the outside, I then will trim off the excess foam. And I know some people say, oh, that's wasteful. It's a tiny little bit of foam, really. It's not massively wasteful. And I personally just think it's easier. It's much easier than trying to cut your foam exactly the same size as your fabric. So I'm just trimming off the excess pieces. You can keep the bits that are sort of bigger, so perhaps a square like this you could use for backing things. If you've got a bit like that, you can use it for backings on some hardware, or for filling out gaps to make hardware fit. So you don't necessarily need to throw it away. So there's my exterior panel with the foam attached. Here's my lining panel with the magnetic fastener attached. And I'm going to lay them right sides together, and then I'm going to have a small moment of panic because I can't see my clips. Where have I put my bag of clips? Okay, I don't know what I've done with my bag of clips, but I do have a clip, because like most bag makers, I kind of have clips everywhere. So I'm just going to clip this together to make sure that it's sitting properly and all the sides are matching. I don't use hundreds and thousands of clips. I don't feel the need to. Some people do, and if you want to and you feel comfortable using a lot of clips, that's absolutely fine. There's no right or wrong when it comes to clips. It's how you feel best suits your style of sewing. So we're gonna, let's put it in that corner there though, because that's a bit flappy. Put that out of the way. What we're going to do is we're going to stitch all the way around the outside, but we're going to leave a gap on the top edge, and the top edge is the one that hasn't got these cutouts on. I like to leave, I don't really know how much I leave, to be honest. It's about 6 inches between the two longer clips, which is what I use as my mark, but I didn't measure it. I've just kind of put them in. So I need to leave a gap between those two clips there. So I'm going to stitch all the way around the outside, and I'm going to reduce my stitch length down again because I'm not basting now, I'm actually partly constructing. This is all fabric, so I'm actually stitching at a number 3 stitch length, which should be about 3mm. That doesn't necessarily mean it actually is, because each machine is different, and this machine's stitch length is slightly smaller, I think, than my Juki, but I usually stitch my construction stitches at between 2 3/4 and 3 1/4, depending on what fabric I'm using on the outside. If I'm using faux leather or cork, then I would perhaps enlarge it a little more even still. So I'm going to stitch all the way around the outside, just doing a couple of back stitches. Check the pattern for the seam allowance, and try and make sure that you stick to the seam allowance, because if this flap doesn't look symmetrical, it will show at the end when you've got the bag all together. So you need to make sure that you do stick to the seam allowance, so you end up with a nice symmetrical shaped flap. Going all the way around the outside. This is a really nice machine. It stitches well, but it is quite noisy. I think she's an older machine. I've borrowed this one from a friend who very kindly let me bring it home after I visited her in the north of the country a couple of weeks ago. Okay, so we've gone all the way around the outside. Now, for all of these corners, so this one, 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 we're going to trim off the corners and take away any excess fabric and foam. For these corners, the ones that are inside the sort of inner angled corners, we're going to do something slightly different. So we'll do the outside corners first, being careful not to trim off your cut into your stitching. So I'm literally cutting it, well, it's not 45 degrees on these ones because obviously that's not a 90-degree angle, but taking away the bulk from those corners. And I'm going to do the same on all of these corners. Once I've taken away the bulk from the corners, I'm going to trim out, I'm going to remove all of the basting stitches and actually take the foam out as well. Now for these corners that are inwards, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a small triangle. So I think you can see there that goes into the corner. It doesn't go through the stitching, so do be careful that you don't go into your stitching. You need a pair of sharp scissors and quite steady hand. So having done that, I'm now going to remove my basting stitches from the foam. It's a lot easier to do once you've actually cut through there. Let's find my seam. I've got the seam here. So let's just remove those basting stitches. From all the way around the outside, and then we can carefully trim away the foam from the seam allowances. We want to try and remove as much bulk as we possibly can to give ourselves a really nice sharp shape. We need we want our flap to be perfectly shaped. We don't want it to be kind of slightly curvy on the corners. We want it to be nice and smart and sharp. So I'm removing the basting stitches from all the way around, other than that top edge, and I'll show you in just a second what I do with that, because we need to remove the foam from that top edge, but we haven't stitched it, so we just need to mark out so we don't actually take away too much foam. If we take away too much foam, we'll end up with flat area in our flap, and we don't want that. So at the top here, what we're going to do is we're going to join up the two ends of our stitching using a pen. So I'm going to use a marker that joins the end of, so here's one end of my stitching, here's the other end of my stitching, and I've just marked the line between. Now I can remove the basting stitches along that top edge. So having removed the basting stitches, we're now just going to take away all of the foam from the seam allowance. And you can see I keep my scissors angled so that what you end up with is a slightly mitered cut. It's almost effectively grading that seam, even though you've only got one piece of foam in it. You need to take off the foam all the way round. Everybody's different with this. Some people prefer to use a smaller scissor, some people like a scissor with a bigger blade, and I tend to veer from one to the other. If I'm honest, it's probably what I've got close to hand, rather than particularly looking for a particular scissor size. It's important that you do this thoroughly, because your flap is highly visible, and because it's shaped, you want it to sit nicely. Else you'll end up with quite rounded corners, which you don't want. It needs to be quite sharp. Now, if you're using a very thick fabric, if you're using faux leather or something like that, then you can actually take out a little bit more on each corner. You can trim the seam allowance back by about half if you really want to. I'm not using particularly thick fabric, but I just wanted to sort of show you that you can do if you want to. It will help you shape your flap when you're finished. Now, along this top edge, we're going to trim out the foam along the stitch line, and then continue along that line that we marked. Obviously there's no stitch line to follow here, because this is sort of open where we've left the turning gap. So I'm just trimming along that mark that I made between the two, the start and the finish of the stitching. So you can see there that we've basically removed the basting stitches. So now I'm going to put my hand into that open gap. What we need to do is put some sorry, nearly forgot that. Put a little bit of duct tape, or bag maker's friend as I like to call it, across the back of your hardware. It will stop any sharp edges on the back of that hardware from rubbing on anything else in the bag. It's always a good practice to get into. So I'm now going to put my hand into that opening, and I'm going to carefully turn this through the right way. I'm just going to pop my iron on to heat up and grab my ironing pad, because I'm going to need to press this. So I'm going to turn it in the right way so it's got its right sides out, and I'm going to use my fingers to push out each of those corners. And it does take a little while to do this. You need to kind of be quite patient. It's no good trying to rush it. And the thicker the fabric that you've used, the more you're going to need to be patient with it. So use whatever your sort of preferred tool is to push out those corners, so that what you end up with is a nice angular, and you want it to be angular. You don't want these to be curves, they are angles. A nice angular shape to your flap. Be careful that you don't push them out too far though, because there are a lot of angles. And what will happen is, if you get really carried away with pushing, is that you'll end up with both sort of the corner. I'm using these two as an example. These two corners will sit nicely, but the bit in between will actually be curved where you've over pushed the corners out, and that, once you've done it, it's very difficult to get it to go back again. So it's a question of slowly and gently, and just give it a little push and then have a check, and give it a little push and have a check. And just keep going for all of those corners. Use your pokey tool inside to kind of along the seams to make sure that the seams are sitting nicely. Okay, I'm quite happy with that. Let's grab my pressing mat. Complete with, this thing looks like it's been bedazzled. It's covered in sparkle from some sparkly fabric that I was using. It's not great. Roll the seams on the sides of your flap, so to make sure that the lining fabric is actually on the back of the flap and not showing on the front. And you can kind of go back in, and if you've got any bits that just don't look quite sharp enough, you can go for it. And I'm just going to give this a press. And what you shouldn't have is any creases and wrinkles in these inner corners. So if you think you have, you may need to turn your flap back the other way and trim out just a little wider triangle from that corner. So I'm going to press this. I'm pressing both sides. Just to make sure everything is as it should be. And this top edge, where we have this open edge, I'm just going to push in the raw edges of both the lining and the exterior fabric. And it should go in quite easily because you've removed the foam. So I'm just folding them both in towards the foam. The lining fabric's actually folding over the foam, and the exterior fabric is sitting to the side of it. And I'm just popping some clips in to hold it in place. It doesn't have to be absolutely spot on perfect at this point, but if it is, then you've done well. What you don't want to happen is that the lining is actually feels longer than the exterior, so you don't really want to see the lining from the outside. So the lining is all hidden. You can actually see on this side my exterior is, I've just perhaps folded it a tiny bit less, so it's actually slightly overlapping. That's fine. So that's our flap looking super. Let's get rid of my pressing mat. Oh, my husband's sneezing in the other room. And now we're going to top stitch around here, but we're not going to touch this top edge at all. We're going to top stitch from here down all the way around back to the same point on the other side. So from this corner to this corner, we are not stitching along the top. Oops, a daisy. Now I'm going to do just a couple of back stitches right at the beginning of this. If you prefer not to, if you want to bury your threads, then that's fine. I find it doesn't bother me, the back stitching on this particular part, simply because we're going to be covering that stitching later on when we attach our flap to our bag. So I'm going to increase my seam, my stitch length a little bit for top stitching, and I'm going to start top stitching. I'm top stitching at a 1/4 inch seam allowance here, but I will do a second line of top stitching that's an 1/8 of an inch away from the edge, because I like a double line of top stitching. It's not mandatory or necessary, it's just showing off really. So trim off any thread ends that you have. And that's your flap done. Now I'm going to add a second line of top stitching because I like to, but it's not mandatory. So I'll come back to you and show you the next stage after I finish that.